Frank Morrison stood at the massive gates of the naval shipyard, watching the aircraft carrier USS Constellation tower above him like a steel mountain. At 72 years old, his weathered hands still trembled slightly from the morning coffee, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. The security guard barely glanced at his application before shaking his head. "Sorry, old-timer. We need younger guys for deck work. This isn't a cruise ship," the guard said with a dismissive wave. Frank's jaw tightened. He had spent 30 years in the Navy, serving on destroyers and cruisers across 3 different conflicts. His knowledge of ships ran deeper than the ocean itself. But all anyone saw now was an elderly man with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. "I've been working ships since before you were born, son," Frank replied calmly, though frustration burned in his chest. "I know every bolt, every system, every emergency procedure." The guard wasn't listening. He was already turning away to help the next person in line, a young man barely out of his teens with muscles bulging from his work shirt. Frank watched as the kid got waved through without a second thought. Walking back to his old pickup truck, Frank remembered the letter from his doctor. The medical bills were piling up faster than snow in a blizzard. His pension covered the basics, but the experimental treatment his wife needed cost more than he made in 6 months. Martha had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and this job was supposed to be their lifeline. He sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the carrier through his windshield. Ships had been his life, his passion, his calling. Even in retirement, he dreamed about the gentle roll of the deck beneath his feet and the smell of salt air mixed with engine oil. The thought of being turned away because of his age felt like a punch to the gut. But Frank Morrison wasn't the type to give up easily. He had survived storms that would terrify seasoned sailors and had once helped save his entire crew when their ship caught fire in the middle of the Pacific. Age might have slowed his step, but it had sharpened his mind and deepened his experience. That evening he called his old friend Captain Rodriguez, who now worked in the shipyard's administrative office. "Listen, Rodriguez, I need a favor. I know they turned me down for deck work, but what about something in maintenance? Inspection? Anything to get me on that ship." Rodriguez sighed on the other end of the line. "Frank, you know I respect what you've done for this country, but the company has strict policies about age and physical requirements. My hands are tied." Frank hung up the phone, feeling defeated. Martha was sleeping in her chair, the oxygen tank humming quietly beside her. Medical equipment had taken over their small living room, and pill bottles covered the kitchen counter like a pharmacy. He needed this job more than he had ever needed anything in his life. The next morning, Frank drove back to the shipyard, not to apply again, but to watch and learn. He parked across the street and observed the workers coming and going. He studied their routines, their procedures, their equipment. If he couldn't get hired the normal way, maybe he could find another path. As he watched, Frank noticed something that made his experienced eye narrow with concern. The workers were cutting corners, rushing through safety checks and ignoring protocols that he knew were critical for a vessel this size. Some of them looked like they had never set foot on a ship before this job. The thought made his stomach turn. Frank had seen what happened when inexperienced crews made mistakes on the water. Ships didn't forgive errors, and the ocean showed no mercy to those who didn't respect its power. But getting someone to listen to his concerns seemed impossible when no one would even give him a chance to prove his worth. That night, as he helped Martha with her medication, she took his hand with her frail fingers. "I know that look, Frank Morrison. You're planning something. What's going through that stubborn head of yours?" Frank squeezed her hand gently. "Just thinking about ships, darling. Just thinking about ships." But deep down, he knew he was thinking about much more than that. He was thinking about proving that experience mattered more than youth, that wisdom earned through decades at sea couldn't be replaced by strong backs and quick feet. Most importantly, he was thinking about the safety of every soul who would sail on that carrier once it left port. Week after week, Frank returned to his observation post across from the shipyard. He brought a thermos of coffee and a notebook, documenting everything he saw. The more he watched, the more his concerns grew into genuine alarm. The crew was making mistakes that could cost lives once the carrier reached open water. Young workers were installing equipment backwards, skipping crucial safety inspections and mishandling sensitive electronics. Frank watched one team struggle for 3 hours to connect a radar system that should have taken 30 minutes with proper knowledge. Another group had welded a support beam at the wrong angle, creating a weak point that could fail under storm conditions. These kids don't know a bulkhead from a breakfast table, Frank muttered to himself, scribbling notes about improper cable routing that could cause electrical fires. His notebook filled with dozens of safety violations and procedural errors. Each mistake was like watching someone play Russian roulette with a ship that would carry thousands of sailors. Frank's military training screamed at him to do something, but his civilian status left him powerless. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Frank noticed unusual activity around the carrier. Emergency vehicles surrounded the ship, and workers were evacuating the deck in obvious panic. Through his binoculars, he could see smoke rising from somewhere deep inside the vessel. His heart raced as he recognized the signs of an electrical fire. Without thinking, Frank jumped from his truck and ran toward the gate. The same security guard who had turned him away weeks earlier was frantically talking into his radio, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. "What's happening?" Frank demanded, his voice carrying the authority of his naval years. "Electrical fire in the engine room," the guard replied, too distracted to remember their previous encounter. "The crew can't locate the source. It's spreading fast." Frank's mind immediately went to the improper wiring he had observed just days earlier. "I know where that fire is. I've been watching your crews work, and I saw them route cables through a maintenance tunnel that's not properly ventilated. When those cables overheat, they'll ignite everything around them." The guard stared at Frank with new recognition. "You're the old guy who wanted a job. How do you know about our internal systems?" "Because I've spent more time on ships than you've spent breathing," Frank replied firmly. "That fire is in tunnel section C7 near the auxiliary power junction. If they don't cut power to that section immediately and flood it with halon gas, you'll lose the entire electrical grid." Inside the shipyard, chaos reigned. The fire department was setting up equipment, but they were treating it like a building fire instead of a ship fire. Frank could see they were about to make the situation much worse by using water on electrical systems. Naval fires required completely different procedures, and these civilian firefighters didn't understand the unique dangers of shipboard blazes. The security guard was torn between protocol and desperation. Smoke was getting thicker, and radio chatter indicated the fire was spreading faster than anyone expected. Frank could see the moment when the young man made his decision. "Look, I don't have authorization to let you in, but if you really know ships..." The guard's voice trailed off as another explosion echoed from inside the carrier. Frank didn't wait for permission. He pushed past the gate and jogged toward the ship, his 72-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had moved in years. Behind him, he could hear the guard shouting into his radio, trying to explain why he had just let an unauthorized civilian enter the restricted area. As Frank reached the carrier's gangway, a young fire chief blocked his path. "Sir, you can't be here. This is a dangerous situation." "Son, I've fought fires on ships when you were still in diapers," Frank said, pushing past the chief. "This isn't a land fire. If you treat it like one, you'll sink this ship before you put out the flames." The fire chief grabbed Frank's arm. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but we have procedures to follow." Frank turned to face the younger man, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Your procedures are about to kill everyone on this ship. I can hear the fire spreading through the ventilation system. In about 10 minutes, it's going to reach the fuel lines, and then you won't have a carrier to save." The gravity in Frank's voice made the fire chief pause. Around them, the controlled chaos of the emergency response continued, but Frank could see doubt creeping into the chief's expression. Years of experience had taught Frank to recognize the moment when someone realized they were in over their head. "What would you do differently?" the fire chief asked, his professional pride warring with growing desperation. Frank pointed toward the ship's superstructure. "First, you evacuate everyone from sections C through F. Second, you shut down main power and switch to emergency systems only. Third, you flood the affected compartments with halon gas, not water. And fourth, you pray that whoever wired this ship didn't make as many mistakes as I think they did." As if summoned by Frank's words, another explosion rocked the carrier, this one larger than the first. Emergency lights flickered across the ship's hull, and Frank could see that the electrical system was beginning to fail exactly as he had predicted. Time was running out, and everyone around him was starting to realize that standard procedures weren't going to save the USS Constellation. The fire chief looked around at his team, then back at Frank. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and traditional firefighting methods weren't working. Smoke was now pouring from multiple sections of the carrier, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. "All right, old-timer," the chief said, making a decision that could cost him his career. Tell me exactly what we need to do. Frank felt 30 years of naval training kick into high gear. His body might be older, but his mind was as sharp as ever when it came to ships in crisis. Get on your radio and tell the shipyard control room to shut down all non-essential power systems immediately. We need to isolate the electrical grid before this fire spreads to the main power distribution center. As the fire chief relayed Frank's instructions, Frank himself headed toward the ship's bridge. He knew the layout of carriers like this one, having served on similar vessels throughout his career. The bridge would have the master electrical controls needed to implement his plan. "Sir, you can't go up there alone," a young firefighter called after him. Frank turned back with a grim smile. "Son, I've been alone on burning ships before. The trick is not to stay alone for very long." Climbing the ladder to the bridge, Frank's legs protested every step, but his determination drove him forward. The smoke was thicker here and the heat was becoming intense. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as Frank made his way to the electrical control panel. His weathered hands moved over the switches with practiced precision. Years of muscle memory guided him as he began systematically shutting down power to the affected sections. Each switch he threw was calculated to starve the fire of its electrical fuel while maintaining power to critical safety systems. Below deck, the fire chief watched in amazement as the flames began to weaken in several areas. "How did he know which systems to shut down?" he asked one of his men. "I don't know, Chief, but it's working." Frank's radio crackled to life. It was the fire chief. "Whatever you're doing up there, keep doing it. The fire's losing intensity in sections C and D." "That's just the beginning," Frank replied, sweat dripping down his face as he continued working the controls. "Now we need to flood those compartments with halon gas. But first make sure every person is out of those sections. Halon displaces oxygen and it can kill faster than the fire." As Frank coordinated the gas suppression system from the bridge, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The fire had spread to a section that wasn't on any of the official ship plans he remembered. The carrier had been modified during construction, and these modifications weren't in his mental blueprint of the ship. "Chief, we have a problem," Frank radioed down. "The fire has reached a section I'm not familiar with. I need someone who knows the current layout of this ship to get up here right now." Minutes later, a young engineer named Sarah Chen burst onto the bridge, her face flushed from running through smoke-filled corridors. "I'm the lead electrical engineer on this project," she gasped. "What do you need to know?" Frank pointed to the control panel where several warning lights were flashing red. "These systems are showing failure in sections that shouldn't exist according to the original carrier design. What modifications were made during construction?" Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what Frank was asking. "We added 3 new server rooms for advanced navigation systems. They're directly below the main electrical junction, and they're filled with sensitive computer equipment. And let me guess," Frank said grimly, "they're not on the halon suppression system because they were added after the fire safety systems were installed." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "If the fire reaches those servers, it'll destroy millions of dollars worth of equipment. Worse, it'll take out the ship's entire navigation and communication systems." Frank studied the electrical diagram Sarah pulled up on her tablet. His mind raced through possibilities, calculating risks and probabilities like he had done countless times during his naval career. The solution was dangerous, but it was their only option. "We're going to have to manually flood those server rooms," Frank decided, "but we'll need to do it from inside the compartments because the automated systems can't reach them." "That's suicide," Sarah protested. "The smoke and heat down there will kill anyone who tries." Frank was already moving toward the ladder. "Not if we're fast enough and smart enough. I've done this before, just not on a ship this big." As Frank and Sarah descended toward the lower decks, the fire chief's voice crackled over the radio. "We're getting reports of structural stress in the hull. This fire is weakening the ship's framework. If we don't get it under control soon, the carrier could suffer catastrophic damage." Frank knew they were running out of time. Every second the fire burned, it ate away at the ship's integrity. But he also knew that rushing the job would only make things worse. Ships demanded respect, patience, and precision, even in the middle of a crisis. "Sarah, I need you to stay here and guide me through the modifications over the radio," Frank said, as they reached the entrance to the burning section. "I'm going in alone." "No way," Sarah replied firmly. "I designed these systems. You'll need me with you to navigate the new layout." Frank looked at the young engineer with new respect. She had the same determination he had seen in the best sailors throughout his career. "All right, but we do this my way." In the Navy, we have a saying, "Slow is smooth and smooth is fast." We're going to save this ship, but we're going to do it right. Frank and Sarah entered the smoke-filled corridor leading to the server rooms, each carrying emergency breathing apparatus that would give them 15 minutes of clean air. The heat was overwhelming and the smoke was so thick they could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Stay close and follow my lead," Frank instructed, his voice muffled by the breathing mask. "In situations like this, your training takes over. But you have to trust your instincts, too." They moved through the corridor like a military unit, Frank leading with the confidence of someone who had navigated burning ships before. Sarah followed closely, calling out directions based on her knowledge of the ship's modified layout. The sound of their breathing apparatus mixed with the distant roar of flames and the groaning of stressed metal. "Turn left at the next junction," Sarah's voice came through the radio. "The first server room is 30 feet down that corridor." As they turned the corner, Frank immediately saw the problem. The fire had spread faster than anyone anticipated, and flames were already licking at the entrance to the server room. The standard halon gas system would never reach this area in time, and the heat was intense enough to melt the delicate computer equipment even without direct flame contact. "We need to create a fire break," Frank said, studying the situation with tactical precision. "Sarah, is there a way to shut down power to this entire section?" Sarah consulted her tablet, squinting through the smoke at the technical diagrams. "There's an emergency cutoff switch in the next room, but it's manual only. Someone has to physically throw the switch." Frank nodded grimly. The next room was completely engulfed in flames, making it nearly impossible to reach safely. But without cutting power to this section, the electrical fire would continue to spread no matter how much suppression gas they used. "I'm going in," Frank announced, adjusting his breathing apparatus. "Wait," Sarah grabbed his arm. "There might be another way. These server rooms have independent cooling systems that use liquid nitrogen. If we can reverse the flow and flood the rooms with nitrogen gas, it'll displace the oxygen and stop the fire instantly." Frank's eyes lit up with understanding. "That's brilliant, but can we control the system manually?" "Each room has a manual override valve, but someone has to be inside to operate it. The nitrogen system will flood the room in about 60 seconds once activated." The implication was clear and terrifying. Whoever went into the server room to activate the nitrogen system would have to work fast and get out before the gas displaced all the oxygen. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they would suffocate in the very gas that saved the ship. "I'll do it," Frank said without hesitation. "I've been in worse situations than this." "No, we'll do it together," Sarah replied firmly. "I know exactly where each valve is located. You'll need me to guide you to them in the smoke." Frank wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to waste precious minutes searching for valves in smoke-filled rooms. They would have to work as a team, trusting each other completely. They reached the first server room where expensive computer equipment was already beginning to smoke from the heat. Sarah pointed to a valve near the ceiling, barely visible through the thick haze. "That's the nitrogen control. Turn it 3 full rotations clockwise, then get out immediately." Frank climbed onto a computer console and reached for the valve. His experienced hands found the mechanism despite the poor visibility, and he began turning it with steady pressure. The sound of rushing gas filled the room as nitrogen began flooding in from the cooling system. "Time to go," Sarah shouted, and they rushed from the room just as the nitrogen displaced the last of the oxygen. Behind them, the flames died instantly as the fire was literally starved of air. 1 down, 2 to go, Frank panted as they moved toward the second server room. But as they approached the next location, Frank's radio crackled with alarming news from the fire chief. "Frank, we're reading massive structural stress throughout the ship. The fire has weakened several support beams, and engineers are predicting possible hull failure if we don't get this under control in the next 10 minutes. Frank felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the kind he had made countless times during his naval career when lives hung in the balance. They could save the remaining server rooms and protect millions of dollars in equipment, but only if they took dangerous risks that might cost them their lives. "Sarah, I want you to head back to safety," Frank ordered. "I can handle the last 2 rooms alone." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied, her voice strong despite their desperate situation. "We started this together and we're going to finish it together. Besides, you need my knowledge of the system layouts." Frank looked at the young engineer with deep respect. She reminded him of himself at that age, willing to risk everything to do the job right. All right, but we do this fast and smart. No heroes, just good teamwork. As they prepared to enter the second server room, Frank thought about Martha waiting at home, probably watching the news and worrying about him. He thought about all the sailors who would depend on this carrier's systems once it reached open water. Most of all, he thought about proving that experience and wisdom were worth more than young backs and quick feet. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her hand on the door handle. Frank checked his breathing apparatus one more time and nodded. "Let's save this ship." The second server room was worse than the first. Flames had reached the computer equipment, and the heat was so intense that Frank could feel it through his protective gear. Metal was beginning to warp from the temperature, and electrical components were sparking dangerously as their insulation melted away. "The valve is on the far wall," Sarah shouted over the roar of flames. "But there's too much fire between us and it." Frank assessed the situation with the tactical mind of a veteran sailor. The direct path was blocked, but years of navigating tight ship spaces had taught him to think in 3 dimensions. "What's above us?" he asked. Sarah checked her tablet quickly. "Maintenance crawlway. It runs directly over the valve location." "Perfect. I'll go up and drop down to the valve. You stay here and guide me." Frank found the access hatch to the crawlway and pulled himself up with strength that surprised even him. The space was cramped and filled with hot smoke, but it was clear of flames. He crawled forward, counting distance and following Sarah's radio directions. "You should be directly above the valve now." Sarah's voice crackled through his headset. Frank looked down through a maintenance grate and could see the nitrogen valve glinting in the firelight below. He kicked out the grate and dropped into the room, landing hard but staying on his feet. The heat was overwhelming, but his breathing apparatus was holding up. His hands found the valve and began turning it. 3 full rotations clockwise, just like the first room. The sound of rushing nitrogen filled the space, and Frank could see the flames beginning to weaken as oxygen was displaced. "Frank, get out now," Sarah screamed through the radio. But as Frank turned to leave, his breathing apparatus caught on a piece of damaged equipment. He pulled hard, trying to free himself, but the hose was tangled in twisted metal. Precious seconds ticked by as nitrogen continued to flood the room. "I'm stuck," Frank radioed, fighting panic as he worked to free his equipment. "The breathing line is caught." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fire axe from the corridor and rushed into the room. Even though nitrogen was rapidly replacing the oxygen, she swung the axe with precision, cutting through the metal that trapped Frank's equipment. "Come on," she gasped, already feeling the effects of oxygen deprivation. They stumbled out of the room together, both gasping as they reached the clear air of the corridor. Behind them, the flames died completely as the nitrogen system did its work. 2 rooms saved, 1 to go. "You saved my life in there," Frank said, looking at Sarah with newfound respect. "You would have done the same for me," she replied. "Now let's finish this job." But as they approached the third and final server room, Frank's radio exploded with urgent messages. The fire chief's voice was tight with stress. "Frank, wherever you are, you need to get out now. The ship's hull is showing critical stress fractures. The whole structure could collapse." Frank looked at the final server room, then at Sarah. They were so close to completing their mission, but the risk was becoming enormous. If the hull failed while they were inside, they would be trapped with no chance of escape. "What do you think?" Frank asked Sarah, trusting her judgment as much as his own experience. Sarah studied her tablet, reading structural stress reports that were updating in real time. "The stress is concentrated in the forward sections. This server room is in the aft section, which should be stable for at least another 10 minutes. "Should be," Frank repeated grimly. "In the Navy, we don't like should be when lives are on the line." But even as he spoke, Frank was moving toward the final room. 30 years of naval service had taught him that sometimes you had to take calculated risks to save lives and equipment. This carrier would carry thousands of sailors once it was complete, and their lives might depend on the navigation systems he was trying to save. The third server room was the largest and most complex. Unlike the first 2, this room had multiple nitrogen valves that needed to be activated in sequence to flood the space effectively. Sarah would need to guide Frank to each valve in the correct order, and they would have to work together with perfect coordination. "This is it," Frank said, as they prepared to enter the room. "After this, we're done and this ship will be saved." "After this," Sarah agreed, "you're getting that job on the deck crew. I'll make sure of it personally." Frank smiled behind his breathing mask. The job offer meant a lot, but right now, All he cared about was proving that an old sailor still had value. He thought about all the young workers who had been hired instead of him, and he wondered if any of them would have the knowledge and courage to do what he was doing right now. "Let's show them what experience looks like," Frank said, and together they entered the final room. The heat hit them like a physical blow and flames were everywhere. This room was much larger than the others, and the fire had spread throughout the space. Frank could see multiple nitrogen valves positioned around the room, each one requiring precise timing to achieve maximum effectiveness. "First valve is on your left, near the main server rack," Sarah directed. "Then we work clockwise around the room." Frank moved through the flames like a man half his age, decades of shipboard training guiding his movements. Each valve turned smoothly under his experienced hands, and slowly but surely, the nitrogen began to win its battle against the fire. As Frank turned the final nitrogen valve, the last of the flames died away in the third server room. The silence that followed was almost deafening after hours of roaring fires and shouting voices. He and Sarah stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, watching the smoke clear to reveal millions of dollars worth of navigation equipment that was now safe from destruction. "Frank, Sarah, report your status immediately." The fire chief's voice crackled urgently through their radios. "Mission accomplished," Frank replied, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "All 3 server rooms are secure. The fire is completely suppressed in the critical areas." As they made their way back through the ship, Frank could see the full extent of what they had accomplished. Emergency lighting illuminated corridors that were now clear of smoke, and the acrid smell of burning electronics was being replaced by the clean scent of halon gas and nitrogen. The USS Constellation was saved. When they emerged onto the deck, Frank was amazed to see dozens of shipyard workers, firefighters, and naval personnel gathered to watch their exit. Someone started clapping, and soon the entire crowd was applauding their efforts. Frank felt embarrassed by the attention, but Sarah grabbed his arm and raised it in victory. "This man saved your ship," Sarah announced to the crowd. "He knew exactly what to do when none of us had a clue." The fire chief approached Frank with his hand extended. "Sir, I owe you an apology. If we had followed standard procedures, we would have lost this entire vessel. Your knowledge of naval firefighting techniques saved the day." Frank shook the chief's hand firmly. "No apology needed, son. Different situations require different solutions. That's what experience teaches you." But the real vindication came when the shipyard supervisor, a stern woman named Margaret Torres, pushed through the crowd to reach Frank. She was the person who had ultimately made the decision to reject his job application weeks earlier. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd, "I made a serious error in judgment when I refused to hire you. Your expertise just saved this company millions of dollars and prevented a disaster that could have set back our entire program by years." Frank looked at the supervisor with calm dignity. "Ma'am, I didn't do this for the job. I did it because ships are my life and I couldn't stand by and watch this one burn. Which is exactly why we need you on our team," Torres replied. "Mr. Morrison, I'm offering you a position as senior naval consultant. Your job will be to oversee safety procedures and train our crews in proper shipboard protocols. The salary is 3 times what the deck position would have paid." Frank felt his heart leap thinking of Martha and her medical bills. But more than the money, he felt the satisfaction of proving that age and experience had value that couldn't be measured in physical strength alone. "I accept," Frank said simply. Over the following weeks, Frank threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm that amazed everyone around him. He developed training programs based on decades of naval experience, identifying and correcting safety problems throughout the shipyard. Young workers who had initially dismissed him as an old man soon sought out his advice and guidance. Sarah Chen became his closest collaborator, and together they revolutionized the shipyard's approach to naval construction. Frank's practical knowledge combined with Sarah's technical expertise created a partnership that prevented dozens of potential problems before they could become disasters. The security guard who had originally turned Frank away stopped by his new office one afternoon. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to apologize for how I treated you when you first applied. I learned something important from watching what you did during the fire." "What's that, son?" Frank asked kindly. "That wisdom and experience can't be replaced by youth and strength. I'll never make that mistake again. Frank smiled and shook the young man's hand. We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. 3 months later, the USS Constellation passed all its sea trials with perfect scores, a record for the shipyard. The navigation systems that Frank and Sarah had saved performed flawlessly, and the ship was commissioned ahead of schedule. Frank stood on the dock with Martha, who was feeling much better thanks to her new treatment, watching the massive carrier leave port for its first deployment. You know what the best part is? Martha asked, squeezing her husband's arm. What's that, darling? You proved that an old dog can still teach everyone new tricks. Frank chuckled, his eyes following the carrier as it disappeared over the horizon. Somewhere on that ship, young sailors were depending on systems that might not have existed if not for his intervention. The thought filled him with deep satisfaction. At 72 years old, Frank Morrison had learned that retirement didn't mean the end of useful service. Sometimes it just meant finding new ways to use a lifetime of experience. As he walked back to his truck with Martha, Frank realized that his greatest adventures might still be ahead of him. The USS Constellation sailed on, carrying with it the knowledge, courage, and determination of an old veteran who refused to be denied his place on deck. In the end, Frank had found something more valuable than a job. He had found validation that his life's work still mattered, and that experience earned through decades of service could never truly be replaced.